You know, there's nothing like fishing on the quiet river. I remember when I was a kid, my grandpa taught me how to fish. We'd get up early in the morning and go out, shovel, find some worms. He'd take me down by the creek and we'd figure out how to tie the bait on, and that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of quiet. We'd put a floater on, just sit back and talk and listen to the stories that he had to tell. And it reminds me, I was in town today and there was a fishing show, and I went in, and it seems that they were having a bunch of workshops there and people were spending a lot of money to get a lot of information. And yet, when it was all said and done, they walked out quite confused.
Are you gonna help me catch a fish?
That may be beyond my abilities at the moment.
You see what I mean? You can learn a lot about tying knots and stream currents and different things and never learn how to catch a fish. It's the same way in stormwater education. You know, you can go to those conventions and you can spend a lot of money and you can get a lot of information, a lot of brochures and things, and never have any practical application. And that's why we want to have Stormwater Awareness Week, September the 21st to the 25th, where we give you practical, hands-on application in the field so that you know what we're talking about when we talk about BMPs. And guess what? It's at no cost. So, it's time to stop spending money and start catching fish.
Welcome to Stormwater Awareness Week 2015. My name is John Tarascus, and I've been your host for this week's Keynote sessions, and we've had quite a week. This has been an amazing week of free stormwater education. We have had 70 workshops. In fact, I think we're going to show on the screen some pictures of this week's events. Live workshops happening all over, from Orange County all the way up to Arcata, California, almost at the Oregon border. Just good live, in-the-field workshops, hands-on opportunities to really get some good practical education and a lot of fun. People have been commenting that they've had a lot of fun coming to these workshops. Well, today is going to be no different. We have with us two guests that are going to talk about fish, in particular about salmon. But before we get into that, just some notes, as this is obviously a live broadcast. If you have any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, you might try pausing the video feed and restarting it, or even just pushing back the timeline just a few seconds and restarting it. But if for any reason you drop out or the video stops or you have to leave, don't worry. This program's being broadcast or recorded, and you can go back and watch it at any time. Or if you know of somebody who would have really benefited from today's program and weren't viewing, send them a link to the video and have them watch it. The other thing about today's broadcast is at the end, we're going to have a question and answers time. And you'll notice right there on the dashboard that where you're viewing is a box where you can type in questions that you might want our guest here today to answer. And so if you think of a question anytime during the broadcast, type it in. You don't have to wait to the very end. At any point, type in a question about today's topic, and we'll be happy to field those to our guest. And so today we have joining with us Michelle Workman and Robyn Bilski, both with East Bay Municipal Utilities District. Welcome, ladies, to today's program.
Good morning.
And I wanted to tell them a little bit about who you are. And so first off, Michelle, you are a supervising fisheries and wildlife biologist at East Bay EBMUD out of the Lodi field office. Mm-hmm. And you manage a staff of about 9 people and coordinate the long-term fisheries monitoring programs, fisheries research, and also habitat restoration projects in the Macomb River. As we'll see during the part 2 of today's program, we're going to actually get to see that. You have 17 years of experience with East Bay EBMUD and 5 years of experience with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service working on the salmonoid management and restoration projects on the Tuolumne River, Merced River, and the San Joaquin River Restoration Program. Michelle has received her Bachelor's of Science in 1991 and a Master of Science in 1999 in Biological Sciences with a concentration on biological conservation from California State University in Sacramento. So welcome
Thank you.
again. And Robyn. Robyn is a Fisheries and Wildlife Biologist II with EBMUD as well, working out of the Lodi office. And she leads the fisheries habitat monitoring, mapping, and restoration projects on the lower Macomb-San Joaquin River, as well as several long-term fisheries monitoring projects, including salmonoid, spawning, and juvenile outmigration surveys. She has 8 years of experience with EBMUD and 6 years of experience with the California State Department of Water Resources and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, working on fishery projects throughout California. Robyn received her BA in biology from Colorado College in 1998 and her MS in biological sciences from California State University, Sacramento in 2008. And Robyn, welcome too.
Thank you.
All right. So you both work for East Bay Municipal Utilities District. Now, why does a utility company hire biologists to work for fish?
That's a great question. So East Bay MUD is responsible for building Pardee Reservoir to supply drinking water to the East Bay area, and then additionally building Comanche Reservoir to provide flood control protection for that reservoir. And in doing so, we basically have blocked about 80% of the historic habitat that anadromous fish in the Mokelumne River would use. And an anadromous fish is simply a fish that spends part of its life in the ocean and part of its life in freshwater. So in blocking part of its habitat, we have mitigation responsibilities to make up for those losses of habitat. And luckily for us, East Bay MUD takes those responsibilities very seriously and have hired an entire staff to make sure we're doing the right thing.
Okay. Now, do you care about all fish species, or what species do you spend most of your time working with?
Well, our main mitigation responsibilities revolve around Chinook salmon and steelhead. But we also conduct fish community assessments and juvenile outmigration surveys that look at all species in the lower river. That includes Pacific lamprey, Sacramento suckers, pike minnow, black bass, striped bass, and many others. We also focus on non-native predator species and try and determine how to reduce their impacts to Chinook salmon and steelhead.
Okay. So what are the current conditions of the Mokelumne River when it comes to salmon population? Are things getting better? Are they declining? And maybe how does it compare with other rivers?
Right. So we've provided a graphic to kind of explain how it looks. And if you look at the graphic, we've got 3 time periods sort of delineated: a pre-Comanche dam, post-Comanche dam, and then what we're calling post-JSA. So JSA is an acronym. It's the Joint Settlement Agreement East Bay MUD signed with the fisheries agencies. That's California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We signed an agreement in 1998 that lists a whole suite of activities and things that we'll implement to do best management practices, basically, for the wildlife and fisheries resources within the watershed. So what you can see is in the pre-Comanche and post-Comanche dam periods, the salmon populations that horizontal line is the average over that period, and each bar represents a single year's return of adults. So the averages were a little bit less than 4,000 fish per year, but what we've seen since we signed that agreement is the average has gone up to over 8,000 fish a year. And in the past 4 years, we've had over 12,000 fish returning to the Mokelumne River in each of those years. So we're doing pretty well. If you look at it compared to other salmon rivers in the Central Valley of California, there's sort of a trend. Like we're at the very bottom of the range for Pacific salmon geographically. So it's a little bit warmer from a climate perspective, and so the populations aren't as robust as they are when you go farther north. So from the Mokelumne River down through the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, Merced, and San Joaquin, Mokelumne is doing really great in terms of those rivers. It's got the highest populations. But then when you look north, some of the Sacramento River populations are much larger, and they're just in a better geographic area. But overall, we're doing pretty well.
Okay, but nonetheless, since 1940, you can see on that graph a marked increase, almost a continual increase. Now, there are, you can notice on that graph, reoccurring dips. What's that about?
So each one of those dips can represent something, an impact. So in that period in the 40s, we still had, it was pre some of the environmental regulations that we have now. And so there were point source sort of issues that happened. We had issues with organics being released from winery waste, and low dissolved oxygen from that event would kill populations in a single year. There's also a cyclic pattern to salmon in general. They have a limited lifespan, and we see boom and bust sort of from a natural situation of either impacts from the ocean or impacts in freshwater, and so some of that is some natural cycling.
Okay, okay. Now, I personally love to salmon fish on the McColmy River. In fact, I think I've shown off one of my salmon I caught here in a recent year on the broadcast. But other than to us recreational fishermen and fisherwomen, why are salmon so important to protect? And what are the benefits to the state, to the local economy, that you get by maintaining a real healthy salmon population? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, salmon are important to protect for a number of reasons, to maintain a healthy river ecosystem, and also to conserve a very important public resource for both recreational opportunities and to help drive the economy. From an ecosystem perspective, when adult salmon return to the river to spawn, they die shortly thereafter, and that's a natural part of their life cycle. But their carcasses contribute nutrients to the river system, and that helps produce invertebrates that juvenile fish feed on. In addition, the adult salmon carcasses contribute a lot of marine-derived nutrients to the adjacent forest ecosystems. And in fact, there was one study that showed that native riparian vegetation, as well as cultivated wine grapes just adjacent to spawning sites on the lower McColmy River, contributed or received up to 25% of foliar nitrogen from marine-derived sources, basically indicating that the salmon are contributing a large amount of their nutrients to those important ecosystems.
Wow, so the nutrients from the naturally dying salmon actually make it into the soil, and wow, that's amazing.
Right, and if you look at the slide, you can see that there are also a lot of native wildlife species that utilize the salmon carcasses as nutrients as well. Pictured in the upper photo is a young fox. There's also a pair of river otters and a group of turkey vultures feeding on the salmon carcasses.
Wow, so it is a whole ecosystem that depends upon it.
Right.
And from the economic perspective, the salmon populations contribute to the local economy, just like you said. You like to go out and fish for salmon. A lot of other people do too. And so what we have locally is we have a couple different fishing guide companies that benefit from the salmon fishery. The local economy, you come here to fish for salmon, you have to stop and get a picnic lunch, and you fuel up your vehicle or your boat. So there's a small contribution to the local economy that's small and significant, but more statewide, the salmon industry, the commercial salmon industry, is a $1.4 billion industry, and it supports 23,000 jobs statewide. So it's pretty important economically as well.
So it's something we need to protect, not just for the salmon themselves and the ecology, but also to protect part of California's economic well-being.
Exactly.
All right. So when we think about threats to salmon in the McColmy River in particular, what are the threats? What is threatening salmon?
Well, there are a number of threats to salmon in the McColmy River throughout their life cycle. When the adults return from the ocean into the river, they experience angling pressure, predation, environmental variables such as low flow, low dissolved oxygen, high water temperatures. They also may stray because of delta flow operations. But if they do return to the river and naturally spawn, the embryos that they deposit in the gravel will also experience threats, again, from water quality, like I mentioned before. They also need an adequate water velocity going through the egg pocket to basically remove built-up metabolic waste products from the egg pocket. But if those embryos survive, they hatch, they utilize their yolk stack and emerge from the spawning gravel, the juvenile salmon will become free swimming, and they experience threats from unscreened water diversions, predation from other fish, birds, wildlife, and potentially a lack of quality rearing habitat, which may not produce enough food for them, and that could contribute to low survival as well.
So they literally experience threats their whole life.
Right.
It's almost a miracle they make it back here to spawn.
Exactly.
Yes.
Wow. Now, this week is all about stormwater. As we mentioned, it's been just an awesome week of free stormwater education. How does stormwater fit into this whole picture of salmon and having a healthy population?
Right. It's kind of an interesting thing for salmon, stormwater. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. So fish respond to those storm events and to the increase in rainfall, the increase in the river level that happens with stormwater events, and then also increases in turbidity. So adult salmon, when they're coming up, will use those periods to migrate. And if you think about it evolutionarily, before there were dams, they had to take advantage of water coming down the river when it was there to move upstream, because in the next week there might be no water depending on how the snowpack was melting, right? So they move up, so that's a good thing. And juveniles use those storm events to move downstream, so they kind of get a little smoke screen to hide them from predators with the increase in turbidity that's related to stormwater events. And so there's these positive elements of stormwater events, but then there's also, we can think about sort of the local impacts from landscape uses and how what is in those stormwater events may be deleterious to fish in the form of constituents that might be in there, like pesticides or petroleum products, things like that.
Okay, so when we think about stormwater runoff and the sources of stormwater runoff, is there a sector that maybe is more of a threat, like maybe urban runoff from a city, streets? Or is it agriculture runoff? Is it industrial, heavy industrial, or construction? Or is it, as was discussed on Monday's program, more just a toxic soup? Everything combined.
Right. I think that that's the situation it is. It's sort of a combination of everything. And I think as you look over the landscape geographically from north to south, and those impacts, whichever is the most contributing, is going to change in every watershed. It just depends. We can look at specifically like the historic impacts on the McCollum River, and we can point to what the point sources were. We had historically in the late 1800s and early 30s, a lot of winery and cannery activity on the lower McCollum River, and very little as far as environmental regulation.
Before the Clean Water Act was really enacted.
Exactly, and so what would happen was a lot of organic waste would get put into the river from those processes, and that would just crash dissolved oxygen, and that had huge impacts for salmon. The other thing, a big thing in the McCollum River's history was mining. So there was a lot of gold dredger mining in the lower river. There was copper mining a little farther up in the river. And so those contributed to acid mine drainage and also heavy metals toxins. So those were historically what were occurring, but currently, we've got all these great environmental regulations, we've done cleanup of old mine sites, and so those aren't really impacting the populations. And now what we look at is going back to that geographic range I talked about, and us being at the southern end of that. And some of the biggest things that we have to deal with in a regulated river environment have to do with just sort of the natural environmental parameters of the water quality, the water temperature and dissolved oxygen, and that's what we're kind of looking at managing.
Okay. So today, are there pollutants of concern that you are particularly focused on? And do those pollutants of concern change throughout the salmon's life cycle?
Well, there are a number of contaminants present in runoff that are toxic to salmonids. Pesticides, petroleum products, and heavy metals are some of the major offenders. And they don't only just affect the fish in the river, but they also affect the invertebrates that the fish feed on. So there's definitely ecosystem impacts. And not only do the threats change throughout the life cycle of the salmon, but they also change depending on the particular contaminant. Medical waste in the form of synthetic estrogen and temperature impacts may actually induce sex change from male to female during early life stage development in salmonids. Pesticides and petroleum products may actually suppress the immune system of the fish, making them more susceptible to fungal infections, bacterial infections, parasites. And dissolved copper may impact their sensory systems, and that may induce behavioral changes that affect their homing ability, their ability to avoid predators. So yeah.
Yeah, so some of these pollutants we're tackling in the stormwater industry, but some are new, like the pharmaceuticals. And also Jeff McLean on Monday's program from NOAA's Fisheries was talking to that as well. New challenges that we're going to be needing to look at, I guess. So has East Bay Mud been active in what we call the 303D list or the TMDL process? And what have you identified as, or what has been identified, I guess, through those processes as pollutants of concern for the McComb River?
Right. So yeah, we have been active in that process, and basically, our activity in that process is responding to EPA, providing comments on the 303D listing, and making sure EPA has all of the up-to-date information from the McComb River to make the best decisions about the listing. And I think you're looking at a table that shows what the current constituents that are that the McComb River is impaired for, and so that includes chlorpyrifos, copper, dissolved oxygen, mercury, total toxins, and zinc. And so we have been involved in, the listing itself, and we've done some operational changes to sort of address some of the ones that we can. We can't address all of them necessarily through our operations, but the things that we can, copper for one thing, there was a copper mine up above Comanche Reservoir historically. We were part of the cleanup of that site, reducing the input of acid mine drainage from that site, and that site is fairly secure at this point. And then in the hatchery itself, below Comanche Dam, there historically was copper piping, which may not seem like a really big deal, but it does contribute to dissolved copper in the water as water goes through.
We're talking parts per billion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we've replaced all of that copper piping. One of the other impacts is dissolved oxygen. So we have had in the past major fish kills related to the bottom water of Comanche going anoxic and then producing hydrogen sulfide, which has killed the fish downstream. And so to combat that, we've put in a multi-million-dollar liquid oxygenation feed system into the reservoir itself to keep the lake from going anoxic. And we have water quality guidelines for the lower river to keep the dissolved oxygen at 7 parts per million. And we can do that using the liquid oxygen and then also changing the way we release water. If we release water through the powerhouse, it doesn't come to the surface and make turbulent dissolved oxygen. But if we sluice water, then it comes out when you see those big streams of white water coming out. Then we're creating oxygen. So we can switch between power generation and sluicing in order to maintain the levels of dissolved oxygen in the lower river that we want.
And certainly all these measures that you have enacted, or East Bay Mud has enacted, it certainly attributes for that increase that we saw in that first graph we looked at.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, this has been very informative, and we're going to take a brief break, and we're going to show a video that East Bay Mud actually produced, and you'll actually recognize both of our guests in the video. They're going to be showing actually how they move the salmon from the spawning from their spawning areas to release it further down the river, and how they promote a healthy salmon population through their efforts. And so it's a fascinating video. I hope you enjoy it. And then after this video, we'll be back to talk more about what East Bay Mud is doing as far as habitat restoration. So we'll be back right after this.
So this represents the first critically dry year on the lower McComb River since the joint settlement agreement was signed in the late 90s. We have concerns about temperature impacts and passage impacts for fish to get through the river. So what we're doing is 7 days a week, we have crews come down here to the trap at Woodbridge, the bypass trap, and we collect the fish and we take them up to the hatchery and put them in a raceway at the hatchery. Salmon are the main fish that used this river to migrate. And when East Bay Mud put in Comanche and Pardee dams, it blocked their access to a lot of other areas of the river that they would normally inhabit. So that's why we have a responsibility to manage for salmon in the river, because we blocked some of their habitat. But from a broader perspective, in California, salmon are a very economically important species. They contribute to, a multi-billion-dollar commercial salmon industry in the ocean. And And so that also, lends itself for us to really concentrate on working with that species.
16.9.
Those fish all get a coated wire tag put in their snout, and what that does is when they come back as adults, we'll be able to tell that these are our experimental release groups of naturally produced fish. Then we load them up into one of the Department of Fish and Wildlife's hauling tanks and take them down to Sherman Island. Release small groups of fish, they're more susceptible to predation because there's fewer fish to escape predators, and they also are disoriented when you just release them directly into the water. And you'll see when they come out of the planting tube, they come out with a gush of water, so they're a little disoriented. It's like taking a dive into a pool and then you gotta find yourself to get back to the surface. That we've been conducting this operation, we've trapped around 40,000 fish. So this way what we're doing is we're stockpiling fish, so we have large release groups, and then we're putting them in net pens, and in the net pens that gives them time to acclimate to the lower river in the delta area. That fish will home back to the area that they were last released, and that's based on their pattern of movement. So they go down the forks and take a left, and then swim a little ways and take a right, and they remember that coming back up. So they get to a certain spot and like, I think I'm supposed to take a left here. We're also releasing them on outgoing tides. So what that means is every other week, 1 week we're going out there at dawn, the next week we're going out there at midday, just to match with the good outgoing tide. So that way when we release the fish, the current is going downstream, and so the fish will follow that current.
Welcome back to part 2 of today's keynote session, and we are talking to 2 biologists and salmon experts from East Bay Municipal Utilities District, and about the extraordinary efforts their agency is going to protect salmon and to promote a healthy salmon population. And so at the end of this segment, you're going to have an opportunity to ask some questions to our 2 experts. So hopefully you're typing in questions, and we'll be taking some of your questions. By the way, if you are enjoying today's program and you are enjoying this subject, and if you happen to be in the vicinity of Lodi, we are having just a great afternoon series of activities and workshops out at the McColmy River. It's going to start with a tour of their hatchery, and I highly recommend seeing that. Then we're going to be talking about, have a workshop about preventing certain pollutants of concern, including a concrete washout demonstration. And then a real treat. We have one of those guides, Bill Ferrero. He's going to be out there giving a fly fishing demonstration in the river and talking about the impact of the low water conditions, the drought conditions, and water quality to sports fishing. And so just a real treat. In fact, I think there's going to be a giveaway to a guided trip in. And then we'll finish it off with a tour of their actual restoration project, which we're going to spend the second half of this program talking about that. So before the break, we were talking about threats to salmon. But your agency has been very proactive, as we've heard, in protecting salmon and mitigating the threats. So why does East Bay MUD invest so much in this hatchery and in this program to protect salmon?
Right. So the hatchery on the McCulmy River is, again, part of the mitigation we talked about earlier. So we reduce the available habitat for salmon. We have to make up for that somehow. And a hatchery is a pretty common way to, in salmon mitigation, to sort of make up for that loss in habitat. So the goal of our hatchery is to make up for the lost spawning habitat. So we only have room for so many fish to spawn now that we truncated the river. And so those additional fish that would have contributed historically to the population go into the hatchery and contribute from that point. And then how we manage the hatchery really depends on how we want those fish to contribute to the population. So we can contribute to enhance the ocean fishery, which is what we talked about, a big billion-dollar industry, by releasing those fish closer out to the bay and the ocean. And we don't expect those fish that will come back in large numbers, but we expect they'll survive very well to the ocean fishery. Or we can mitigate for the fish lost in the river, and those fish we release a little bit closer to the bottom end of the McCulmy, and that way our hope is that those will come back, and some of those fish will spawn naturally in the river, and some will go into the hatchery. And the key is trying to find a balance between the natural fish and the hatchery fish.
And that's what we saw in the video.
Exactly.
Of, both you and Robyn doing just that.
Right.
So the idea is that the fish come back by smell. How does that work? That they track through smell and?
They do. There's a couple of different ways that that fish home. The most common, I think, that people understand is olfaction or smell. So they smell the constituents of the water that they were reared in as juveniles, and that's what they come back to. The other thing is they do have a memory, sort of like a muscle memory of the route they took. So some of the interesting newer research in homing is that they will home efficiently back to the final release point, and then they sort of have a little bit harder time. So there's some memory. It's not just the olfaction. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. So you also operate the Comanche Lake Dam, and especially in light of the current drought that we're in, how is the dam and the lake levels being managed in order to protect fish and wildlife, especially this year?
Right. So that's a great question, and EBMUD is very well poised to handle this situation. I'm sure lots of people viewing have looked in the news and saw there's, not enough cold water in Folsom Reservoir, the Stanislaus, New Melones, the cold water pool is very low. And the big concern is not only this year, but the next coming year, and that affects the populations for out to 3 years. So if we look at the graphic, we have a graphic of Comanche Reservoir and cold water. What EBMUD can do is operate Pardee and Comanche together as one system. And it gives us a little more flexibility than some of these other systems have. So we have a lot of cold water stored in Pardee, but we're really depleting what's in Comanche. And if you think about the way reservoirs stratify, so we have this nice layer of cold water on the bottom, and then we have warm water that develops through the summer from ambient warming, and we want to keep this cold water intact. Well, what's happening in these other reservoirs is that level's getting so low that the lake is mixing earlier than it should, and the water is very warm. But what we have Pardee that has all this cold water, and we can change our operations. So in a normal year, we would just meter out an amount of water from Pardee to Comanche. And if you can imagine, if you're metering out a small amount, it's going to hit Comanche, and it's just going to dissipate across the surface, and it's going to warm with the rest of the water. But if we hold on to that water a little bit and then we send a giant slug down, it's actually going to dive down and hit that hypolimnion and support that cold water. So that's how we're managing it. And we have modelers in Oakland that are doing a fabulous job of looking at how much that big slug has to be, how long we have to have the duration of that slug in order to improve the cold water. And then we want to have enough cold water to make it all the way through the spawning season until ambient conditions start to cool the entire reservoir.
Okay, wow.
Additionally, we have an adaptive management clause in our agreement with the Fish and Wildlife agencies. And this allows us to change our minimum flow requirements in times when water quality and habitat aren't necessarily limited to the fish.
Right.
So if you look at the third graphic, you can actually see in 2014, basically if you look at the black line, those are our minimum flow requirements for salmon during different life stages of their development. But if you look at the red line and the purple line, that's how operations actually occur. And you can see in 2014 that between March and April, we actually reduced flows, our minimum flows, because again, water quality and habitat weren't limiting it at that time. And we saved that for the fall pulse flows. So between October 1st and November 1st, we actually released a series of pulse flows to draw adult salmon into the system so we could have spawners, not only in the river, but coming into the hatchery as well.
Okay.
And this is all done as a part of a collaborative effort between EBMUD, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NIMFS, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Now, is this concept of pulse flows, is that a relatively new concept to this?
It's not, well, I guess in the history from the 1940s till now, yes, it's a relatively new that it's being implemented. Conceptually, just like I said before, you know, those stormwater events are what attract salmon up, right? So we're just mimicking those events. And we're also trying to get that chemical signal from the reservoir and the river out into the delta. So when the fish hit the delta, they can smell that McCollum River water and they know which way to go.
Okay. So you just also completed a habitat restoration program project. And as we mentioned, our viewers are going to be able to see that for themselves this afternoon. If they're in the local area, they can head on out. And if they need information, you can go to stormwaterawareness.org and register for that and find out where the class is at exactly. But could you tell us a little bit about that project, the purpose of the project, what you did?
Yeah, absolutely. This summer, our restoration project is really just a small portion of what we've been doing for over a decade. We have a restoration project that begins at Comanche Dam and extends 1 mile downstream, where we've actually been increasing the channel bed slope and improving water velocities through that reach and creating a series of pool riffle sequences that we can maintain under our current flow regime. And we do this by basically injecting spawning gravel into the river. The reason we need to do this is because Comanche Dam blocks that connection of sediment transport in the river. So we no longer get fresh slugs of gravel coming through the system. It's all blocked by Comanche Dam. So we have to artificially supplement that. And that gravel, again, it's used by spawning salmon and steelhead for their embryos. And it's also a part of the natural ecosystem. In addition, this year we implemented a floodplain habitat restoration project. And this is done because a lot of Central Valley rivers, including the McCollum River, have become disconnected from their natural floodplain because of incised channels and levees, flood control measures. So this year what we did is we went ahead and created a 0.25 acre floodplain habitat for juvenile salmon, and basically that's used as foraging habitat, as refuge from high water velocities and predators. And actually, if you look at the second picture, you can actually see not only an excavator in the back, but a gravel sorter in that floodplain habitat that we're creating. And on the right-hand side, you can see this big pile of gravel, and that's actually used for spawning habitat. So we go ahead and place that back in the river as part of our spawning habitat restoration project. So we're actually providing dual benefits to the species.
Okay, so it's not only a nursery, but a place where they can spawn and mate and have the eggs be protected.
In different areas, but yeah, that material that we excavate to create that nursery habitat can go into the riffles where the salmon actually spawn with the higher water velocities.
Okay, and when you spoke of injecting gravel, that first picture showed the method you injected. It's actually a rubber tire loader.
Correct.
Now, what kind of thought needs to go into, I imagine a lot of planning goes into a project like this. What types of steps did you have to go through to get ready for this project?
Well, there's a very elaborate permitting process, which I'll let Michelle elaborate more on because she's more or less in charge of the permitting. On the design side, I actually did the hydraulic modeling and looked at a variety of flow scenarios and tried to determine how to build that bed elevation to maximize salmon spawning habitat and juvenile rearing habitat. So how do you build the bed elevation and pool riffle sequences to create a lot of spawning habitat, some rearing habitat, and go ahead and maintain that pool riffle sequence over the long term. So looking at flood flows and how sediment transport may occur within that reach.
But the permitting processes, and I imagine you got to get permission from quite a few agencies.
It's an onerous process. It starts about 2 years before we get in the river to do work. We have to comply with CEQA and NEPA, obviously, and create, for this size project, a mitigated negative deck for CEQA and an environmental assessment for NEPA. We work with our federal partners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, on developing those documents. Once we have those documents in place, and there's a whole litany of permits, and we have to comply with all of the same permits that anyone in the public would have to apply for and comply with. So we have a state permit for stream bed alteration. We have an Army Corps permit for cut and fill for the gravel. We comply with the Clean Water Act. We worked with you this year on a stormwater prevention, pollution prevention plan, erosion plan. And yeah, so it's a big process. We have to contact the flood board. We have to contact lots of agencies. We also contact all the landowners along the river corridor to let them know the project is happening, because there will be changes in turbidity that will fluctuate on and off. They'll see, brief changes of elevation as we sort of move the loaders out into the water. We sort of build very temporary sort of cofferdam type situations on parts of the river, and it changes things for the landowners. And so there's a lot that goes into it.
Are landowners and the public generally supportive of projects like this?
They're definitely supportive of the project from all kinds of perspectives. And I think, if there are concerns, that we try to address those. There may be instances where folks are concerned about how these projects may affect erosional processes on their properties downstream, how it affects the fishing habitat upstream for the anglers. There's lots of good questions, and but generally people walk away satisfied with what we're doing.
Well, speaking of questions, what kind of educational resources does East Bay MUD offer to the public, to adjacent landowners, to people interested in just about protecting salmon and wildlife?
Right. So I think we've provided you guys with a few links, some sources of websites. Our main website, EBMUD.com, has a lot of resources on what we do for the natural environment, water conservation efforts. We also, our office in Lodi, are available, and we work a lot with local school groups or local community organizations. We participate in river cleanups, and so we love to go out and talk about what we do, because we like doing it, and we like other people to get excited about it as well. So we do that, and I did want to highlight, we did work cooperatively with the San Joaquin County Resource Conservation District on developing a watershed user's guide. And this is just a brief self-assessment tool for folks to use to look at how their activities around their home, like how they wash their car, or how they change their oil, or how they put out pesticides for bugs in their garden, how those impact the waterway, because everyone's storm drain leads to some waterway, some to the McCollum River, but some to other waterways. But there are ways that we can modify our activities that are painless, that reduces the impact of all of those constituents we talked about earlier. So I'm going to be bringing these out. I have a box of these out to our field visit this afternoon for folks that can come. And for folks that can't come, if you go to the San Joaquin County Resource Conservation District webpage, you can actually get an electronic version of that. It's kind of a little fun effort to go do a self-evaluation and see where you fall in the risk category, and see if there's ways that you can improve.
Well, I know the city of Lodi is the closest city to the area we're talking about, the hatchery and the day use area. And I know the city of Lodi has used that quite a bit. Kathy Grant through her education outreach program, and really trying to focus on encouraging residents to be river friendly.
Right.
All right. Well, you also give a list of some of the different other websites. I particularly found the Nature Conservancy Salmon Snapshots project. That website's amazing.
That is
lots of information.
Fabulous website, and it's just newly been developed. It's taken a lot of collaboration to get the right data on that website, and they've done a great job. And that's a really great public access data site for salmon information in general. Great.
Well, we are now going to open it up to questions from our audience, and so I want to field those to you. And so, again, if you haven't done so already, enter that into the box, and we'll be taking a look at those. Just to start it off, there is a lot of talk in the news about restoration efforts in the Delta. Are there projects in the Delta that will help with McColmy salmon?
Yeah, so when the McColmy enters the Delta, it actually forks into two separate channels, the North Fork and the South Fork in the Delta. And currently there's quite a large-scale habitat restoration project that's been in the work for, I would say, more than a decade. And that, again, goes to some of the collaboration needs and permitting needs and issues. But that project is called the McCormick-Williamson Tract Project. And basically, what that project plans to do, if you can think about the Delta, when you get down to the Delta, the channels all look very deep, very U-shaped. There's very little fish-friendly habitat. It's a sort of a move or die situation for a juvenile salmon. If you don't hustle through there, there's lots of predators kind of waiting to meet with you. And so this project actually is going to breach some levees on the McCormick-Williamson Tract and shave down some of the elevation and create like a nice shallow water habitat. And what that does for juvenile fish, when they make it that far, gives them a place that they can get onto, but predators can't, and a lot of food production because it's shallow water, so it gets a lot of sunlight penetration, so they get a lot of food, they can grow really fast. It's sort of a rest stop in the middle of the Delta for them to grow bigger and then get out.
Okay. Good. And it just we were talking earlier that survival, there's so many things against them that you need to give them every opportunity to be protected from some of these threats.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of a threat, we just recently saw another one, and there's a question here about the butte fire, and that's in the watershed for the McColmy River.
Right.
What's your thoughts on that? How is it going to impact water quality for your drinking water supply, but also for the ecological things we've been talking about? Is that fire or other fires like it, do they have an impact on what we're talking about today?
They certainly do, and that's something that EBMUD has come right out in the forefront right now and started sort of collaborating on how are we going to manage this impact. So right now, what we see, and most of the impact was outside of East Bay MUD-owned property, but it is certainly within our watershed. And so what there's a lot of scarred landscape, the vegetation is gone, there's a lot of ash, there was a lot of fire suppression activities, so there's borate and other chemicals in the water that they used to fight the fire. And so what we need to look at is how are those going to enter the watershed and what do we need to do? So we're in the process right now of developing a monitoring program. We'll be going out next week to collect baseline data at the forks of all three of the upper tributaries, the middle fork and the north and south fork in the upper watershed, and then some right above Party Reservoir. And so we get a snapshot of what it looks like above the fire and what it looks like below the fire right now. And then once the rainy season hits and some of that material starts to enter the waterway, we'll continue that process. We're working with CAL FIRE and Bureau of Land Management, who had most of the property that's publicly owned that was affected by the fire, to make sure that we have can get in sync for remediation actions that we can all participate in. And we're also looking to what our ability to work with private landowners will be. There's some issues with an agency like EBMUD funding private property work, but given that it's been declared a state of emergency, we may have some flexibility to actually help some of the private landowners in the process of beneficial use for our water rights on the river. So we'll be definitely doing a lot of work related to that.
All right, great. Here's another question we got in from our audience. Talking about invasive species, what invasive species are really threatening the McColmy River, and is your agency doing anything to eradicate them? And I guess we might be talking about fish as well as plants and other invasive species.
Yeah, one invasive species that comes to mind, especially with the drought that we're having, is aquatic vegetation, particularly Elodea, that grows over the gravel spawning beds that the salmon use to construct their nests. So to attempt to combat this problem, we were talking about how we adaptively manage the flow and how we provide pulse flows in the fall, not only to draw up salmon, but it also provides benefits gravel cleansing benefits, and it may
Kind of
remove
flushes
some of
the
that.
system.
Yeah, that Elodea off of the spawning beds. So that's one invasive species that we're looking at. Others would include striped bass.
Oh, yeah.
They're a
predators.
very large predator of concern, and at pinch points during the outmigration of the juvenile salmon, these striped bass can have very substantial predation impacts on the salmon. So what we do is we go out and we not only monitor these impacts, but in some years we'll actually relocate the striped bass to other areas in the delta where they don't have such substantial impacts. For example, Woodbridge Dam would be one of those pinch points where they can just wait below the bladder of the dam and just feed on the juvenile salmon that are coming over the spillway. But if we remove those striped bass and put them in the delta where there's a much larger river channel and the salmon can actually avoid them, that provides a benefit to the salmon and gives them a little higher odds to make it out to the ocean.
And it's not a point of eradicating. It's interesting because striped bass is, again, a highly economic valued fishery in the delta, right? So we can't wholesale eradicate striped bass,
Right.
because that would be against someone else's charter, and there would be
Right.
people that wouldn't appreciate that. So in just reducing the impact, we
Managing.
can, just manage it for the impact and leave both fisheries intact is sort of our goal.
And so do you work closely with Fish and Wildlife to maybe control limits of how many striped bass can be taken, or is there a coordination with other agencies?
Not so much in developing the limits, but we do definitely have conversations, and all of the research that goes on and all the management we do, again, rolls back to that partnership we talked about earlier based on the joint settlement agreement. So we continuously talk with the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Marine Fisheries Service on how we're implementing all of these actions, and we get agreement for everything that we do before we do it.
Okay. And just one more question. The hatchery, is it open to the public?
The hatchery is open to the public 7 days a week from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. There's a little self-guided tour. You just follow the fish that are painted on the sidewalk. And you can see, right now there's not many fish in the hatchery. We do have some 1-year-old steelhead holding. Everything else is out. We're waiting for the adults to come in. The best time to visit the hatchery is right around Thanksgiving or just before. It's the peak of the salmon run. Lots of activity, and the self-guided tour actually
But
takes
if you're a little
you.
squeamish, there's a warning, right?
Yeah, so salmon naturally die after spawning
Yeah.
anyway. We do facilitate that process in the hatchery in order
Yeah.
to take the gametes for the next year.
But it's a fascinating tour,
It is.
fascinating process.
Yep, it's an excellent place to visit. I encourage
Some of
people
our
to visit.
viewers may not be familiar with this area. Could you tell us just a little bit more about where it's located and how they could get information about how to find it?
Sure.
And also talk about the day use area. It's amazing.
Right.
It's a beautiful park.
Right, so the hatchery is located east of the town of Clements. So from the Lodi area, the best way to access that would be Highway 12 east, which turns into 88, or it's 88 east and turns into 12. And it's off of McIntyre Road. So if you just follow that towards Valley Springs till you see McIntyre Road, and that's where the hatchery is. It's at the base of Comanche Dam. And then East Bay Mud owns a little bit of the property right below the hatchery and operates a day use area, which is open from dawn until dusk all year long. There's just some, it's just a very user-friendly park. It's got barbecue pits and garbages and porta potties, big parking areas.
Yeah.
There's a car top boat launch, so if you want to raft or kayak, you can put in there and take out at the Macville Park, just downstream about 10 miles downstream.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just a nice close to Lodi way to take
It's
your
gorgeous.
kids and see some nature that you might not have known was in your backyard.
If you come in the late fall, late November, you might have an opportunity to see Chinook salmon spawning in the river channel. And it's free parking, so.
Our family has been there many times. We don't live too far from there, and I don't think there's been a single time we have been there that we haven't seen some wildlife. Turkeys, fox, bobcats, deer. Almost every time we're there, we see wildlife. It's just a beautiful place, and I would just invite our viewers to spend a day there, especially in the fall. It's gorgeous.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank you both for being a part of today's program and the Stormwater Awareness Week, and we're really looking forward to this afternoon. It's going to be just a fun afternoon. Hopefully many of our viewers can come. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for being a part of this year's Stormwater Awareness Week, the 3 keynote sessions we had online, and perhaps going to one of the 70 workshops that were held all over California. And so we look forward to seeing you next year at the 2016 Stormwater Awareness Week. Thank you for being a part of today's broadcast.